No one can really remember how many years ago it was before most of them were here again. It's in the 20s. I was here. They were fun last time. They're absolutely fantastic tonight. Here they are! David Hardman.
Headlines and the newsreels. It'd be good to hear some of the background stuff. Oh, here I am. Oh, I'm late. Hey, that is a tough act to follow, the Blue Angels. Holy cow. Anyway, good evening, everybody. To start our Apollo evening, attention to the big screen, please. And here's a little backgrounder on the space program from the 1960s. If you want to watch the screen.
I can see it from here.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. We've had a problem here.
Can you say again, please?
Houston, we've had a problem.
Stand by 13, we're looking at it.
Missile Mars, go. RF systems, go. Propulsion, go. AMR telemetry. Telemetry quality. First recaps, go. Roger, we're programming it. Roll, okay.
We are now used to having thousands of man-made satellites zooming around our planet. About 1,100 of them are active now. But until 1957, there was no such thing as a man-made satellite. That's when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, they called it, into orbit. It was 184 pounds, a little bigger than a beach ball, and as it zoomed around the Earth, all it did was beep. And that beep told the world, we, the Soviets, are first in space, and we beat the United States in getting there. Then 4 years later, in 1961, the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. And 1 month later, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. The space race was on. In April 1961, just a few months after he was inaugurated, President Kennedy challenged America.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
One of the original astronauts, Wally Schirra, was fond of saying, quote, the most important part of the president's statement was returning him safely to Earth, end quote. At the time, it seemed impossible to get to the moon, but the entire country was behind it, and the United States ramped up fast. There were 3 programs, 6 one-man flights called Mercury, then 10 two-man flights called Gemini, and finally 11 three-man flights called Apollo. Each flight had new challenges and unknowns, and each flight built on the knowledge learned from the earlier flights. Just 8.5 years after the Kennedy Challenge, Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. There were 30 Apollo astronauts, 12 of them walked on the moon. Most agree that this was the greatest single scientific human achievement in history. It was accomplished by hundreds of thousands of dedicated Americans, patriots, brilliant engineers, scientists and managers, academics and technicians, and of course, risk-taking aviator astronauts.
Odyssey Houston standing by, over. Odyssey Houston, we show you on the main. It really looks great. Oh, under Apollo 13, this is recovery, and your chutes look good.
So welcome our panelists. Our first guest tonight is actually the only one who's not an astronaut. Aerospace engineer, a retired Air Force F-86 pilot, flight director and manager for Gemini and most of the Apollo flights. He is a huge part and the heart and the soul of the space program. Welcome, Gene Kranz. Next, he's a Marine fighter pilot and physicist. Worked for many years as a civilian at the RAND Corporation. Apollo 7, the first manned Apollo flight. Retired Marine Colonel Walt Cunningham. Annapolis graduate, naval aviator, attack pilot, test pilot, flew 2 Gemini missions and 2 Apollo missions. Retired Navy captain, Jim Lovell. West Point graduate, Air Force fighter pilot, test pilot, master's degree in aeronautical engineering, flew Gemini 7 and Apollo 8. Air Force retired Colonel Frank Borman. Air Force and Navy fighter pilot, both. Engineer, research test pilot for NASA, flew Apollo 13, Fred Hayes. Another West Point graduate, Air Force fighter pilot, has a PhD from MIT in astronautics, flew Gemini 12 and Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin. Air Force fighter pilot, flew the F-100. I went to the test pilot school at Edwards. He is the youngest American astronaut flying the X-15 at age 32. He was backup crews for 2 Apollo flights, but also flew Cap Commander 2 STS shuttle missions, and is the only shuttle commander to pilot the shuttle from orbit to full-stop landing at Edwards manually. This is retired Major General Joe Engle. You outrank everybody. And the poor guys whose last name ends in W get stuck all the time. Darn it. West Point graduate engineer degrees, interceptor test pilot for Apollo 15, a retired Air Force Colonel, Al Worden. Al? Yeah. Oh, we got too many chairs here. You know what? Maybe we can spread out. Yeah, spread out a little bit. It looks like, yeah. Huh? Wait, you can separate. So, you know, if you like the guy next to you, you can sit next to him. If not, you can, you know. Gene, sitting down at the far end there, start us off, would you? You know, we see so many newsreel, you know, the highlights of all the Apollo and all the Gemini missions, but we never or rarely talk about what it takes to get to become an astronaut. We hear some of the background, but Gene, criteria, what kind of criteria? I mean, they're all great aviators to begin with, but what is NASA looking for besides great pilots?
Well, I think the first thing they want to do is find one of these astronauts that are going to respond to a flight director. And then after that, if that doesn't work, I turn the surgeon on them.
But
no, actually, the training process in the early days was very interesting. You have to really go back into the late 50s, early 60s, and address how did we train the crews? How do we train the controllers? You know, the simulator that the Mercury astronauts had was basically what you would say a procedures trainer. It had basically a series of switches in there that represented what's inside the cockpit. And basically they provided an indication when they're flipped to an instructor at the console. So this was basically a procedures trainer. There was virtually nothing that you could do related to the mission except for the crew to follow the flight plan. The instructor at the console would do this. In the meantime, in Mercury control, basically we had what we call a sim soup. It was very early days. And as the spacecraft would theoretically go around the world, various sites would have seen it, he'd run around, pass his pieces of paper out. And it'd go to the surgeon that says, your astronaut just had a heart attack. And we tried surgeon would now fake it. What would he do if he had a sick astronaut in orbit? So basically the process was extremely rudimentary. It was typical, I think, of the early jet fighters they had in there, where basically you spent a lot of time in a cockpit, and basically you got your flight plan, you knew your procedures, and you basically applied the throttle and started moving forward. So that was Mercury.
Walt, even though you're all pilots, in terms of training, you're a Marine, so you went through particularly difficult early training, I assume.
Once a Marine, always a Marine.
Yes, sir. Understood. But how was the training process for you, given what you'd already been through in training, for you to become an astronaut to be accepted?
Well, back in the days when I was flying, at the time I came to NASA, I was flying with the reserves because I decided I ought to go to college when I was 24 years old. So I started college there, and I was flying with the reserves, and I don't think with this audience, I ought to give exactly my reaction when I was listening to Alan Shepard's first liftoff, but I wanted to be a fighter pilot, which I felt quite successful at being, and it was after Alan Shepard's first liftoff, May 5th, 1961, and well, I will tell the story. At that time, I was working half-time at the Rand Corporation, going to UCLA, lived in Canoga Park, had to go over to Santa Monica every morning because I was trying to earn a living. Back in those days, we did not get free college and all that. Ooh. And I was listening, it was a little before 7, I was listening to the countdown of the first Mercury mission. And when it got down to the last 5 minutes, I could not go any farther. I pulled over and parked at the side of the road on Mulholland Drive. And I'll never forget, got down to 3, 2, 1, liftoff. And I heard this voice screaming out here, "You lucky," well, SOB. I just cut it short. And I was looking around to see what it was, and I realized it was me doing that screaming. And that was when I decided what I was going to be trying to do. And 2 years later, I was sharing, 2.5 years later, I was sharing an office with Alan Shepard.
Wow. Frank, man, how was the training process for you once you were selected as an astronaut to be then selected to actually fly? How tough was the process, or not?
Well, it really wasn't that difficult, but it was involved an awful lot of learning. We spent, you can hear me now? We spent an awful lot of time at the different factories, and we went to academic courses and so on. But it was basically a course in immersing yourself in a new industry. At least for me, it was new rockets. I don't know if you guys have been around rockets before. I never had been around them.
Right. So, Al, even though you got W, right?
I'm always last.
Yeah, you poor guy.
Right.
But W, how was the process for you in adapting after the flying career?
It really wasn't a very big transition. I was teaching at the Test Pilot School at Edwards. I had gone through the Empire Test Pilot School in England. I worked for a guy by the name of Chuck Yeager, who was a rather interesting individual. And Bob Buchanan was the deputy, and Jay Hanks, Norris Hanks, was the head of academics there. When I got selected into the program, I have to tell you, the first thing that happened is that I got assigned to Wally Schirra. And Wally was a captain in the Navy, and I was a captain in the Air Force, and I went in and let him know that we were both captains, and so I really didn't have to worry about what he had to say. And I found out that I was very quickly sweeping his floor and getting him coffee, because that's what happens to greenies. That's what happens to newbies down in Houston. We weren't worth much until we made a flight. But I didn't see a lot of transition for me, because one of the first things we did was we got checked out in T-38, so we started flying. And then we went through a classroom session of about 6 months. And after that, got signed to an engineering program on Apollo 9. And of course, when we had the fire at the Cape, I was on the recovery engineering group at the manufacturer. And so there was a lot of engineering to do, and that would have been the kind of engineering I would have done anywhere. So it was only after all of that I really saw some differences. I got assigned to Apollo 12 backup, and then Apollo 15 prime crew, and it was quite different.
Well, Gene Kranz, in the video, I talked about the fact that each mission was built on the successes and lessons learned from the mission before. How much was learned from Mercury leading into Gemini, and how successful was that process to get to the two-man flights in Gemini?
I think the transition was relatively smooth. We had experienced crews coming out of the Mercury program that generally were the mission commanders, the commanders that moved into the Gemini program. So then they moved some of the newer astronauts in there. By this time, however, the simulation process had really expanded almost exponentially. We had basically systems that could fully represent the spacecraft systems. We had basically computers, a very simple computer on board the Gemini spacecraft, about a 4K machine. But basically this now provided the astronauts information as to some of the things that were happening to them once they got on orbit. I believe that the real breakthrough in training occurred during the process of simulation, because now we had an instrument that would basically complement the classroom and the learn by doing, because we all spent a lot of time in the factories, working the procedures, down at the Cape with range safety and all that. So basically it was a combination of learn by doing, okay, and then take that and apply it during the simulation training process you had.
So those first Gemini missions, including Ed White, what was that, Gemini 4?
Gemini 4.
4 was the first EVA. But those first few Gemini missions, how successful were they leading up to what we're going to talk about in a moment with Gemini 7?
Well, Gemini 4 was the EVA. I wrote the procedures. Actually, I got a call because that was my first mission as flight director. And Kraft called up and says, "Are you ready for your flight director?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "That's good." He says, "Because we'd like to do an EVA." Ed White's been in training over in the laboratories over there with some of the equipment they had. And what I want you to do is go over and basically get fully knowledgeable of the equipment he's using, what are the tasks he's trying to do, what are kinds of limitations they got when you apply it within the spacecraft. And basically it was just to sit down and talk yourself through what you were trying to do and then try to translate that into procedures. And we had a marvelous crew systems division with absolutely superb engineers that were providing the hardware. So again, it was one of these things, you know, at that time, risk was virtually everything we did, but basically we became adept and good managers of the process of the missions we flew and basically controlling the risk associated.
What happened with 6 that led to 7 that Frank and Jim flew? What happened with 6 that allowed 7 to happen? Frank or Jim, you want to grab that? Jim?
Well, of course, what happened to 6 that permitted a lot of different things to happen, which was sometimes the way to go, was the fact that 6 was all set to do the first rendezvous. And it was, what was it? It was Frank, no. Gina. Well, Gina, but who was in the 6th? Puzzle? Stafford and Schraub, that's right. Stafford and... I apologize for him, he's getting old. We're the same age. Anyway, Stafford and Schraub were going up at 6, and the Gina was launched. The Gina was lost, and so they had to recycle. And here's where good management came into play. 7 was going to be a 2-week mission. So can we recycle Apollo or Gemini 6 to go rendezvous with 7? Now 7 did not have a docking device on it, but can we just, you know, prove out the rendezvous? So that's exactly what they did. We were up for about 8 days, I think, at the time, and then there was a second attempt to launch, and the engines ignited on the vehicle and then shut down right away. Fortunately, Wally Schraw was a little slow in doing the aborts, and consequently everything was fine. And so I think on day 12 of our flight, 6 took off and did the rendezvous. And so we accomplished that rendezvous by good management and seeing how we can get Gemini 6 up with 7.
You notice that Frank and Jim are sitting next to each other. They broke the record at the time for length of time in orbit, and that was Frank and Jim together in Gemini 7. And Frank, how was 14?
I would like to know how many people in the audience would like to spend 14 days in a volume as small as the front seat of a Volkswagen Beetle with a sailor.
I know plenty.
So guys, describe what those 14 days were like. Togetherness takes on a new meaning, perhaps.
Well, as a matter of fact, we got down after 14 days, and we're on the carrier. The first thing we did, we looked at each other and we said, we just wanted to announce our engagement.
What did the frogmen say when they opened the hatch?
Well, it was pretty smelly in there. There's no question about it. But Jim and I didn't notice it because we'd gotten used to it, and it was fine. But the one thing he didn't mention, I do remember, Jim, that we sang one song for 14 days. One song. Let's pretend that we're all together, all alone. You remember that Jim Reeves song? Put your sweet lips a little. I didn't know he was transgender at that time.
You soon found out. You know, it's kind of interesting to get two people so close together and no place to go, no way to move out, that I think either I or Frank lost the toothbrush. It didn't make any difference. We used the same toothbrush for 14 days.
So the mission was a success in more ways than one. It was beginning to sound like a Get Shira night, but maybe it's going to turn into something else at this point. Gene Cernan did an EVA before too long in which Gemini was Gene? 10? What? 9? 9. And how did that go, Gene? Or who wants to grab that? It was
I think Cernan described it properly. He says that was the EVA from hell.
Yeah. So as a result of Gene's experience, which he used to rest his soul, his description of it really told that story and how difficult it was. But that was a message to leadership, right, that something had to be done.
Well, the key thing was first of all, the task they laid out really didn't fit the experience level that we had in EVA by that time, first of all. Second thing is they had not established the anti-fog compounds they needed to clean that visor because he was virtually flying blind for the best part of the EVA. And the third thing is that we probably should have looked better at the exterior of the spacecraft because his traverse path back into the cockpit was a lot tighter than we thought. So basically it was, there was a very strong learning, but unfortunately we did not really use what we had learned in the 10 and 11 mission. It was only when we got to 12 that we really understood the nature of EVA and learned to train the crews in the neutral buoyancy environment.
So Jim, that was your commanding a second flight. That was your second flight, but Buzz, you were the guy that was training to do that next EVA. What was the training process to make your flight a better one, your EVA a better one than what Gene had?
Well, I'll start, but I'll let Buzz finish. There's essentially three.
You stayed in the spacecraft.
There are three essential failures. 9 tried. We didn't understand Newton's third law of motion. To every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, which meant that every time that the astronaut got near a big vehicle like the Gemini, since we were neutralized in Earth's gravity, it reacted. And so essentially what happened to Gene Cernan was he got overheated, he was really tired to do it. And this also happened in Apollo 10 and Apollo 11. And then there was Gemini, I'm sorry, not Apollo. Gemini 10 and 11. And then there was a fellow, I don't know where it came from, he said, why don't we use water immersion to simulate zero gravity? And so on Gemini 12, and I'll let Buzz tell the rest of the story because he's the one that actually in a boys' pool in Baltimore, we were able to sink a simulation of the spacecraft, and we put Buzz in a space suit, which could be just as well underwater as it is in space. We made him neutrally buoyant. We said, Buzz, don't try to swim. And then we went down and looked at various handholds and footholds. But Buzz did all that work to come up and make Gemini 12 successful.
So Buzz, what was that training like for you?
Well, I'm glad that you heard me okay?
Yeah, fine.
I'm glad that Jim gave us all the preliminaries all about EVA, you know. Now this maneuvering unit, the AMU, it was the #1 Air Force experiment on the whole program. And the crew that was originally going to fly on Gemini 9 was commanded by Elliot C., a civilian, General Electric test pilot, and perhaps one of the best Air Force test pilots we had, Charlie Bassett, my backdoor neighbor. So an Air Force person was going to fly the #1 Air Force experiment. Well, unfortunately, that crew went into St. Louis in a snowstorm, and they crashed into their hangar where their spacecraft was, and both of them were killed. My backdoor neighbor. So the backup crew took over, and now we have, instead of an Air Force test pilot going to fly the Air Force #1 experiment, now we have a Navy test pilot who's going to fly the #1 Air Force experiment. Now, this is the way you should have told it, Jim, from the Navy. Now, when some engineers in Baltimore decided that it would be a good idea maybe to train in a different way, and a few of you test pilots said, well, how in the world can you simulate being in a vacuum up there by being underwater, you know, moving around? Well, see, I'd been scuba diving for 8 or 9 years at the time, and I really felt that this was going to work, and it really did. And we did a lot of good training. I can remember standing in the pool, waist deep, seeing Gemini 11 lift off. You don't remember that? Well, where were you? You were supposed to be there with me. No, he was watching me, yeah. Well, anyway, Gemini 11's rendezvous didn't go too well either. So the pressure really was sort of on us. The last flight out of 4 main missions of the whole Gemini program were long-duration space flight, computer guided re-entry, rendezvous in space, and spacewalking, so that we would know how to do things out on the lunar surface. And I had done a little bit of studying about rendezvous. As a matter of fact, while I was at MIT, I got a call from Ed White, who I'd known from West Point. We were in the same fighter squadron. And he said, you know, I've been through the test pilot school, got a master's degree, I'm testing airplanes. And he said, I'm going to volunteer for this second selection process of astronauts. This was
I think
in
the
62.
question was EVA,
I
and
know.
how do we solve that problem?
Well, I'm
Going
getting
underwater
to it.
and using water immersion.
Because Ed said, I'm qualified. And I said, well, okay, so I haven't been through the test pilot school, but I'm doing some pretty interesting things up here at MIT. Now,
Buzz,
I was picked in the 3rd group. Now, I show up in this program with all these experts, and I happen to get involved in the training of some of the astronauts, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford and some others for the early rendezvous flights. So I remember having a conversation with Deke Slayton. I said, you know, I would really like to be along on one of these rendezvous flights in the Gemini program. And when you ask Deke Slayton something, you don't get an answer right away. So I went out, and the next thing I know, Jim Lovell and I are assigned to the backup crew on Gemini 10, which means that they have, when flies, they have a crew for 11 and 12, so we were going to be prime crew on Gemini 13. There is no 13, so Buzz was not going to fly in the Gemini program until there was a tragedy. My backdoor neighbor. And so we backed up 9, and then we became prime crew on 12.
Buzz, what were in the EVA, what were you able to do in the EVA in 12 that Gene was not able to do in 9?
Well, we had excellent foot restraints by this time. I mean, you could put your foot in the foot restraint, and there was just no getting out of it. You could take one foot back and lean over, and you were still attached. They were called the golden slippers. They were really wonderful. And as I was training for this astronaut maneuvering unit, and I really felt like we were going to have a really good, successful last mission, and somehow NASA felt that the series of missions where spacewalking had not been too successful, and they decided to cancel this #1 Air Force experiment in the whole Gemini program. And that was my biggest mistake, not to tell them that I really knew what I was doing with the kind of training underwater. But I let it go, and they removed that experiment, and instead there were just sort of Mickey Mouse things to do in the back of the adapter, hook a piece of Velcro together, screw this thing, and throw this switch. And so obviously it was a very successful rendezvous.
But the,
I mean,
the EVA, yeah.
So what did we do? We went to a Navy place, Pensacola, and everybody got checked out in scuba diving, even the Navy guys.
So you had a successful Gemini 12, which was the end of the Gemini program, right, Gene? That was it. So then, and then we're on to Apollo, and of course, Randy, did you want to jump in with something there that I cut you off? I apologize.
No, we're fine. At the time that we were flying Gemini 12, many of us were working that mission. We were also getting ready for Apollo.
Right.
So we had the first of the Saturn launches there. So basically we had both control rooms up and operating there. And that was probably one of the toughest times from a standpoint of scheduling and training we ever had.
So, so Apollo 1, you know, the tragedy of the fire in Apollo 1 and losing Ed White, Burge Grissom, Roger Chaffee. Frank Borman, you were the only astronaut on the investigating committee, the 21-month period. What happened in those 21 months? What was the process? What was learned? And how confident were you when you got to Apollo 7?
Well, I think that the genius of Jim Webb, who was the NASA administrator, shone through there, because he convinced Congress to allow NASA to investigate itself. And they appointed a group of people, of which I was one. But the investigation was no holds barred, and it was a very hard-hitting indictment of both NASA and North American. And I think that out of that came the Block 2, we called it an improved Apollo spacecraft that eventually was very, very successful. And I honestly believe, had it not been for the fire, we might have had a in-flight tragedy that would have canceled the program. So I think that NASA at that point was probably the finest managed federal bureaucracy that's ever been in place. And sometimes I look back on it. I look back on it, and from the country standpoint, I think we'd have been a lot better off if NASA had been running the Defense Department during Vietnam rather than who was.
Fred Hayes, you know, we're not up to 13, obviously, yet, because we're going in sequence here. But what, in terms of personnel and training, what were you doing while all these other things are going on to bring you up to speed for whatever you would be assigned down the road?
Well, at the front end, when I joined the program, was the same as Al described. We went through about 6 months of textbook training, some rudimentary field trips, first geology field trips, and then we got assigned to different disciplines. And I got assigned to Jim McDivitt, who was going to fly the first LEM, and Ed Mitchell and I. And he gave us very simple marching orders. He said, I want you to go to Grumman and make sure I got a good LEM. That was it. So Ed and I together, I'm sure mutually, I know I spent 7 months out of 9 months at Grumman in test, and I'd been in test in every vehicle up through 6. In fact, I did not do any tests on the one we flew on 13, but I'd been in vehicle test, sometimes slept in LEMs. I probably had several weeks sleeping in LEMs when the test would get halted, and you just stopped and waited for the next things to get figured out and proceed. So that was kind of what I was doing in that period. In fact, I was up at Grumman at the time the Apollo 1 fire came, and Jim called me and said, come home.
So even though you weren't assigned to crews at this point, and back to Gene for a moment, everybody was deeply involved in this whole engineering process, working together to make the whole program work?
I think we were very fortunate because not only we had top-level leadership that made things happen, we had a mission control team now that become probably the finest systems engineers that existed in the planet at that time. Because generally our training process, you started training early, was to send the controllers out to the factory, get to know the people who are doing the design and testing, bring back the bundle assembly drawings that was used to build the spacecraft, translate them into documentation that you could use in real time. We did the same thing up at Draper Labs, get the program listings and then decompose that to stuff that was useful. So this is the sort of background we had when we went in to help Frank and the team that was looking at what do we got to do different for this next generation of Block 2 spacecraft.
After the fire in Apollo 1, Gene, you had a meeting. What did you say, and what was the result of your...
Well, this was, I had a bunch of young pups. They'd never been through a disaster of this type before, and I got them all in a conference room. And I started off talking about the fact that we ought to assume responsibility because we were behind the power curve in our work in mission control. The control center wasn't ready. The training process wasn't working. Nobody really had done their job. And I think across the board from a standpoint of program, we all had to assume responsibility for that particular failure and the loss of the crew. And basically I talked about and established 2 words which are going to be the sounding board. We're going to use tough and competent. We're going to put it on our blackboards and we won't erase it until we finish the Apollo program. Tough meaning we are forever accountable for what we do, and in the case of Apollo 1, what we failed to do. I was in the console on the shift before that accident, and there are things I think I could have done.
Mm. Walt, so you're on the crew for 7. First manned flight. How confident were you in the entire process because you were going to fly it?
Well, at the time we flew, I was quite confident in it, but what people today don't realize is if you talk about the Apollo program today, most of the public thinks of Apollo 11, maybe Apollo 13 and that, but to put the whole thing in perspective, we were originally, Wally Schraw, Don Isley, and I were on Apollo 2 crew, the same spacecraft as Apollo 1. All the changes we were trying to make in it caused a lot of delays. It got canceled. Then we became the backup crew for Apollo 1, After 3 months, we had the fire on the pad and lost our prime crew. 3 weeks later, we got the first Apollo mission. And I have to tell you that the spacecraft was certainly not great, like Gene said, but in the next 21 months, we lived at the contractors. I was on the road maybe 275 days one year, I remember. But we, I think it was 1,040 changes that were made in the spacecraft, some of which were for the systems and the mechanics. But a lot of it was for the operational changes that we had wanted to do before and had been passed up because of the delay that it would cause in the schedule. So we got all those kind of things in. So when Apollo 7 actually flew, it was the most successful first test flight ever, even to this day. And I'll add one more thought here, what the public doesn't think about. That was the first of 5 giant steps to the moon, every one of which was very critical. We tested the command module. And Apollo 8, it broke the concern people might have from getting away from the Earth's gravity. They went out around the moon. Apollo 9, then they were testing the lunar module. That was done in Earth orbit here. I think that was a pretty risky mission because if they couldn't get back together, there was no heat shield on the lunar module. In Apollo 10, they had a complete rehearsal for the Apollo 11 landing right down to 50,000 feet. So when Apollo 11 went, actually everything had been done before except that last 50,000 feet. But it was one hell of a fine job, nearly perfect.
Frank and Jim. See, I'm saying Frank and Jim now. I don't know, is that right? And I said, okay. Frank, Apollo 8. The mission was changed from what to what and why?
Jim and Bill Andrews and I were originally on Apollo 9, which was really a repeat of Apollo 8, a Earth orbital rendezvous mission with the lunar module and the command module. The lunar module, thanks to Fred's diligent inspection, it was way behind, and so they. I didn't mean it that way. You're making it perfect. and the CIA had pretty good information that the Soviets were going to go around the moon before the end of the year. So we were out at Downey. I got a call from Deke Slayton to come back. I got in the airplane, went back there, and I walked in the room, and he said, "We want to change Apollo 8. I want to change your mission to Apollo 8 and go to the moon in a lunar orbit mission in December. Can you do it?" And I said yes. And I went back and told Jim and Bill, and I think we're all delighted with that mission on that change. Well, it turned out to be a very exciting process, and it all worked perfectly.
So describe the mission, Jim. You launch and you head to the moon. You leave Earth's gravity. First time human beings had ever done that, right?
Well, there are certain changes that were required. Number one was the fact that we weren't going to do an Earth orbit, but we're doing the navigation 240,000 miles all the way to the moon. So one of the changes that had to be made in the short time that was allotted was changing the whole navigation system. And consequently, I caught myself up at MIT a couple days and learning the new technique that they had developed for using the stars for navigation. And then, of course, our other job was looking for suitable landing spots to make sure that the spacecraft that would land, which we didn't know at that time, we'd have the greatest chance of survival. So those spots would be the smooth areas. We call it the Mare or the seas. But I think that when we look back at Apollo 8 with Frank and Bill and myself, that what really came from it was several things. One, and I think that Bill says it graciously, Bill has also always mentioned that, hey, we went to the moon to explore the moon, and we discovered the Earth, which I think it puts it in just one thing. Bill's photograph, I think, said it all in one
So
picture.
you admit that Bill Anders took that photograph?
Well, that's been 25, 30 years, I guess.
They're very reluctant, but yes.
Yeah, yeah. and then coming back, and you have to remember the tenure of the time. I mean, 1968. The Vietnam was going on. There was dissidence in the universities. There was 2 assassinations of prominent people. There was disruption in the Democratic convention. And yet, in the last bit of the flight, just taking off on the 21st of December, 3 guys to orbit the moon for the very first time, and to mention that the first 10 verses of Genesis, which I thought was very appropriate at that time that we did that, to come back, I think that put a cap, finally, on a very sort of bad year of '68. And what was that? You got an email, or not email those days, a telegram, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Apollo 8. You saved 1968.
Wow.
Saved 1968.
When you got around to the back of the moon, how surprised were you at what the back of the moon looked like, if at all?
Well, we had photographs of the back of the moon prior to us going. So we did have some pretty good idea. The far side of the moon is not like the near side. The near side has these huge seas, Sea of Tranquility, Sea of Serenity. The back side is more concentrated in smaller craters, lots of craters. There's 2 prominent features that the Russians first found, because they were the first people to actually photograph the backside. But the only thing that really came out of their photographs was one of a crater called Tsiolkovsky, which is a beautiful crater with a white center and a dark mare in the middle. And then the Sea of Moscow, which they named, which is the one sort of large area of a hit of something, much like the near side. But most of it is gray sand or gray looking, no color whatsoever, sort of forbidden in a little way, some awe-inspiring in some other way, and it was something that you realized what was there, and it was challenging. But like I said, I think what we brought back, more so than the later lunar flights, because the ones that landed on the moon, that was their job. Our job was really to open up the fact that what we really had back here on Earth, that for the very first time.
What was that moment like when you came around, when you finally saw Frank, when you finally saw Earth? And
I don't hear too well. What'd you say? What did he say?
Well, he said, what is it like when we first saw Earth?
Well, I think that was the high point of the mission for all of us, looking back at the Earth. It's the only place in the whole universe that had any color. And we were a long way from home, and that sort of focused our attention for longer than it should have. I had trouble keeping these guys busy doing their job because they all were looking at the Earth. But I want to mention one other thing. We had, 4 months, right, Jim, to prepare for and usually it takes at least over a year to prepare for a flight. And in one afternoon, we were able to knock out a flight plan for Apollo 8, thanks to the genius and the leadership of Chris Kraft, one of the great, I would say, heroes of NASA, and the only one that's still living. They're all. So I think any discussion of the Apollo program is remiss if you don't mention the part that Chris Kraft had in it.
what was that? How much time did you have to get those pictures of Earth? How quickly did that have to happen? That turned into the stamp. Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Yeah.
The sequence of actually taking that photograph was something like this. I think it was taken on the third revolution, because the first two we were concentrated on what we were doing, looking at the moon, checking out the craters, making sure the orbit that we had was consistent with what was going to happen in the future. And then on the third orbit, we suddenly saw on the right window, I think, in fact, I think it was me, the funny, the Earth came up, and I said, look at that. And then either Bill or Frank said, oh gosh, look at that. And then I said, we ought to take a photograph of that. And but that time the spacecraft started to move. It was moving around, and we lost sight of it until it came around to the left window. And I saw it up again, and I said, you've got to take a photograph of this. And so Bill got the camera, but it had black and white film in it, and I got the color film after he yelled at me once or twice. And he put the color film in, and then, of course, he took the picture. But I'll let you know a little secret. I said, Bill, this is the way it goes. You compose it in this manner. You see how the lunar surface goes down this way, and the Earth comes up that way. Now, just now, okay, take it. And I showed where the button was.
I'm going to tell Bill what he just said.
You know, you could do that right now, Walt. You know, you got one of these if you want.
Jim, I
Frank.
remember there was a time when Neil was a backup on Gemini 8, and you and I were on the crew because Mike Collins was on Gemini, or the E mission to begin with.
Let's go back to the Bible. Whose idea? Where did that come from for you? You three, you and Bill.
It's a good thing. I think Frank could probably really tell more about exactly how we read the first 10 verses.
As one of the geniuses of NASA, one of the things that I thought was unusual again about this organization, we were told about 6 weeks before the flight that we were going to have a television program around while we're going around the moon that would probably have the largest audience that had ever listened to a human voice. And you know, we were all up to our ears and trying to figure out what we were going to do. And so I asked Julian Scheer, who was head of PR, I said, what do you want us to do? And the only answer we got was something appropriate. He said, do something appropriate. Can you imagine that happening today? Huh? And so we were busy, and we all tried to come up with something, and that it all ended up seeming trite to us. So I had a good friend in Washington, Cy Borgen. I called him up, and I said, Cy, you got to help us. He had worked for Newsweek, and he was a wonderful man. And he tried to come up with it, and he couldn't. So he finally passed it off to a friend, Joe Leighton, I believe it was. And he was a long-time writer. He couldn't come up with it either. But finally his wife, who had been raised in a convent in France and was a French resistance writer, came down after he'd been making attempts all night. And she said, well, why don't you start at the beginning? And he said, where? And she said, Genesis in the Bible. And that's how it happened.
Wow.
Incidentally, we never got that. We didn't clear it. We didn't. I don't think you guys even knew what we were going to say. That was a genius of this country. It was wonderful.
Wow.
One more little tidbit on this. After we did that, we got back. We were sued for combining government and so. We were had a talk at Congress with a joint venture, and we mentioned that, and the Supreme Court justices were down there, and they said, "Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it."
Al?
You got Madeline Murray O'Hare that sued, right?
Jim, wasn't that Frank? Madeline Murray O'Hare, right?
Madeline Murray O'Hare, yeah, exactly.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning was the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning was the second day. God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on this good earth.
So, Walt just said the next mission's 9, 10, all set up 11. So, Buzz, how confident, what did you think the odds were that you and Mike and Neil were going to not only get to the moon, but walk on the moon and get back in one piece? What did you think the odds were?
Well, Neil and I ended up, along with Fred, on the backup crew for Apollo 8. And so, 9 and 10, we would be on the prime crew. But Neil felt that Mike Collins had missed the flight on Apollo 8 because Jim Lovell was going to fly with Neil and I, and it wasn't because Jim Lovell talked so much that he moved to Frank's flight on Apollo 8, but it was because Mike Collins needed a back operation for a pinched nerve. So that's why Fred ended up on the backup crew for Apollo 8. And now Neil felt that Mike, having not been involved in Apollo 8, should be involved in Apollo 11. And I guess they finally felt that I was up to that kind of a mission. So when the announcement did come up, I remember going back and saying to Joan, we're going to land a mission, or going to make a try, and I would almost prefer to be on a later flight that does more interesting things, but rather than being at the peak of all the public attention, which I did not look forward to at all, but I realized that the crewmates I had, there was no way that I could even come close. And so that person at that time, my wife, was the only one that knew I said anything about that at the time.
So how surprised were you when Neil got out said what he said, walked
No,
on the moon,
in-
and then took that picture of you. That's you in that
Yeah.
photograph from Apollo
But-
11.
But in the training, the three of us felt that maybe there was a 60% chance that we would be able to land successfully. But of course, there were many things that could happen. Right, Frank? Or Jim? Yeah, there were many things that could happen that would cause things to be aborted. So we felt there was a 95% chance of coming home safely, but a 60% chance of being able to successfully land.
What do the
and
numbers-
6 out of 7 flights landed on the moon, and we were not using a Ouija board or anything. We just guessed that was about our odds.
What do the numbers 1201 and 1202 mean to you?
Well, before the mission, not a whole lot. We knew that there was a book about this thick with all the procedures and all the program alarms that could come up. And we had started the descent, and as we were starting the maneuver, going face down, Neil looked down and he said, "I think we're going to be a little bit long." And I said, how in the world could he possibly, at the beginning of powered descent, come up and say, "I think we're going to be a little long"? Well, a little further along, we had to yaw around and pitch forward so the landing radar could pick up the surface. And so now we're facing forward, but still the engine is pointing. And a while after that, a program alarm comes on. And what it does is it wipes out the displays of what you're looking at, and the alarm goes. And so you shut off the alarm, and it restores it to what it is. But we don't know what the program alarm is. But there's this dictionary bound between us, and we were just not going to pull out the dictionary to look and see what it was. But there happened to be an engineer who had been very well schooled, and I think you ought to take over from here, Jim.
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting point there, because go back into, you mentioned training when we started. And by this time in the space program, the training was truly exceptional. And we had a team of controllers whose principal job was to test the team from a standpoint of knowledge, the integration with the crew right on down the line. We got a Capcom, I had Charlie Duke in this. And generally the final training run was always looked at by the team as sort of graduation exercise. Why the simulation supervisor that decided this team isn't ready to graduate yet? So he threw us a descent series of problems in there, one of which we started exercising or experiencing various program alarms. And we aborted. We saw the program alarms. We aborted the training run. And then SimSoup comes in and says, "Flight, why did you abort that training run? Your mission rule says you need 2 cues. What was your second cue?" There was none. So we got together with the Draper Labs, and overnight we learned an awful lot about the program alarms. And it's interesting, the actual descent, Buzz mentioned that we were going to be downrange. What happened, the crew had not fully depressurized the tunnel. We have a dumb computer on board the spacecraft, so over the period of time at 2 orbits, basically we're now further downrange than we should have been. And immediately, as soon as we acquire, my trajectory guy says we're halfway to our abort limit on radio component of velocity, and abort is not a word that you use casually in mission control. But basically we worked that problem. We were starting monitoring that. But as we were waiting for the landing radar to come in to update the true altitude that the spacecraft was above the surface, we experienced that same set of program alarms that we had in our final training run. And you want to talk about gobbling up that problem, boy, we were ready. We sucked that thing up. Charlie Duke passed it up. He'd say, we're going that alarm, going that alarm. So basically, a lot of times I think back to the quality of the training we had, but in particular, the quality of the instructors that we had that were teaching us.
By the way, what is the average age of the controllers?
At that time, we were between 26 and 27. The majority of controllers were roughly about 4 years out of college, 4 to 5 years.
Let me add, at that time also, the average age in the astronaut office was probably about 38, something like that. And the oldest active astronaut we had was Wally Schirra, who retired at the age of 43. And I think today the average age in the astronaut office is above 45.
Right.
Gene, you had an experience on a simulation flight that had a program alarm before Apollo 11 launched.
We had some alarms of that type back in the Apollo 9, but basically we found that was really an aberration that was in the simulation software at that time. That was not really an issue. But again, that brought us up to speed to look at computer program alarms.
So
we had a great bunch of people working down in the trench, our trajectory guys. And Steve Bales was the guy, believe it or not, after the course of the mission, the team voted. We went out to the West White House, and we had this big party out there with President Nixon, and my guidance officer accepted the award for the team that day.
So 11 is a big success, and the whole world knew it. Fred Hayes, well, 12 was good, and that went fine, Gene. Fred, 12, there's a crew change. So Mattingly can't go, Sweigert's in to join you and Jim. How much did that affect what you were doing, and how soon did that happen, the switch, before you had to launch?
Well, that week, when the exposure happened with Charlie Duke at a birthday party, he had his son at, and we were all exposed because normally prime and backups were together in some way at a meeting or whatever every day. And they started taking blood every day and shipping it off to some doctor in Cincinnati who was the world's expert on measles. And it turned out at the time that, unfortunately, Ken and Jack Schweigert were both bachelors, but Jack had had measles, and Ken had never had measles, even as a child. And it was highly, obviously, suspect maybe he would come down with measles. And I know Jim argued that, well, what better place can you come down with measles than floating around in zero-G in that comfortable environment? But that was not bought, and unfortunately. And so Jack replaced Ken 2.5 days before launch. It was very emotional at the time because I'd served on 2 backups. I'd been the backup on 8, and then I was backed up Buzz on 11. And the way mentally I always got into it was to not suffer the disappointment of not flying. About within a month before the flight, I'd sort of mentally back away and say, well, I've done all this work, but I'm just going to go get to watch somebody else fly. So you kind of mentally backed away. And I'm sure Jack Schweigert was in that mental state. And of course, on the other hand, when you're fixing to go fly, you look out at that big booster lit up at night, and you sort of get little butterflies. You say, man, this is finally going to happen. So it was a radical emotional shift for both of those individuals. Unlike what was kind of a connotation in the movie, there was absolutely no question in our minds that Jack could perform the mission. Technically, and do what he needed to do. So there was never any concern that way. It was more this personal thing, and unfair, because Ken had a lot of friends he invited and family to come to the launch. They had irreversible motels, signed up for several days, had airline tickets, and they obviously now were coming to see a different person fly. We had PPKs, a personal preference kit. And I spent some time with family and friends to small things. You were very restricted on size and weight, on what I might fly for them. And obviously, Jack didn't have the time to do that, and Ken had one already packed on board. So it was more that connotation of that shift out from a technical standpoint. We went through simulation. I think we were in simulators to about 8 o'clock the night before launch, mainly going through the dynamic phases, just launch, entry, and rendezvous, even though we used, obviously, the same books, same checklist, same procedures. We wanted to make sure that when certain things were called, that the backup crew hadn't developed a vernacular in talking to each other that we might not be aware of. So we went through it from that standpoint, not the fact that Jack couldn't perform what he needed to do.
So, Jim, you're 200,000 miles out. What happened?
Well, first of all, let me mention two things. Jack had helped develop the malfunction procedures for the command module. So if we had to have a replacement for Ken, Swikert was the guy to have. So we were very happy with him, even though he suddenly got on board when he didn't expect it. The second thing, which is a little bit more humorous, during this change around and all the stuff that he had to do to get ready, about 1,000 miles out after we were going, Jack says, "I forgot to file my income tax." Now you have to remember, this was April 13th, or about that time, and he didn't file his tax. And so that was sent down to Mission Control, and a little while later we got the reply, "Don't worry, the president will take care of it." Things were good for the first 2 days. The major change that we had, which made it again dicey, this was actually a mission that was plagued from the very beginning. It had a damaged liquid oxygen tank installed, unknown to us, which got further damaged during the last test. We had an engine go out on the liftoff of the Saturn V. The center engine of the thing went off. And then, of course, 2 days out, on April 13th, that explosion occurred. It was one of the third landing to one of survival at that particular time. But it's a monument to the mission control people who were able to take a certain catastrophe and with the help, with their help, and we could finally take over and overcome all the crises that we had.
So, Gene, what's going on in control at that point when you know something bad's happened? So what kind of mode are you in at that point?
Well, the key thing was when we started off, the lunar module was not supposed to be active, so I did not even have a team in place during this phase of the mission. You don't power the thing up until you get up in the lunar vicinity, the lunar orbit up there, and get ready to actually go through the start of the descent procedure. So the key thing is that I had just a single controller in there, and they were reviewing their procedures. It was about 55 minutes into the flight. We had just finished the television broadcast with the crew that we had up there. They had secured the television, and basically my backup team, next team, was coming in for shift changeover. So we went through the normal pre-sleep checklist and got down to the final item, which requested a cryo stir. Now, the fuels we use on board the spacecraft, cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen, and basically they tend to stratify and develop into two-phase condition, part liquid, part gas in the tank. So they had some pumps, not pumps, but devices in there to spin it up and basically make a homogeneous mixture in the tank. So that was basically what they were doing. They were doing the cryo stir, and basically very shortly thereafter, I got a call from the crew that basically indicated, "Houston, we got a problem." I went through 3 phases of downmoding in there because we had already seen a couple electrical problems on the same shift in there. And we had basically unexplained antenna shift in the communication system. We also had an instrumentation problem. So as soon as Jim called, I thought, gee, we've seen a lot of electrical glitches when we'll get the crew to sleep, and then we'll start working this problem. Shortly thereafter, one of the controllers said the crew reported a pretty large bang, and now I was down-moded to tread lightly lest you step in some stuff you don't want to step into. But about the time, about 12 minutes after this event, Jim indicated they were venting the oxygen, and basically then it was survival mode. So it was basically, we'll solve the problem, tread lightly, survival. And that was basically the sheet once we went through.
So Jim, who said what? What was the actual verbatim line that was said to control?
That famous line, here's the actual situation, because people ask me that, on and on. The first time, Jack said, Houston, we've had a problem here. Now, that transmission went down to Mission Control. Jack Losba was the Capcom, and I think there was a change, or he didn't hear it. So he said, say again, please. And then I said, Houston, we have a problem here. I repeated what Jack said. I said, we have a main B bus undervolt. And that's the electrical problem which I first relayed to Mission Control. So that's how that whole sequence came, and my only regret is that I didn't incorporate it or do something.
So when you looked out at the explosion, what did you see?
Well,
what had happened?
It dawned on me. When the accident first occurred and we lost 2 fuel cells right away, I saw that and they went out the line. But mission controls, or mission rules stated that if you lose 1 fuel cell, the landing on the moon is off. 1 fuel cell alone will give you enough electrical power to get around the moon and back home safely. And so there was a wave of disappointment right now, because I thought to myself, I've been here already. My idea is to land on the moon, not just to go around the moon. And then I looked up at the instrument panel, and my eyes focused on the instruments that told me the condition of 2 huge liquid oxygen tanks. And when I looked at the quantity gauge of one of those tanks, the needle read 0. And when I looked at the quantity gauge of the second and last tank, I could see the needle go down ever so slightly, but something that you would never see in the normal usage of oxygen on a flight to the moon. And that's when that old lead weight went down over my stomach, and that searing sensation you get when you're in deep trouble and don't quite know how to get out of it.
So what happened then, Gene?
Yeah, one of the things Frank mentioned earlier was the quality of the leadership we had. Throughout this entire problem, particularly in the first 24 hours, they didn't seek out briefings, et cetera. They were following along, and their question was, how can we help you? And that was the kind of people that we had in there. They were letting the young pups work the problem, but basically they were superb, our bosses.
So how quickly did you make decisions, and what were they about what you were going to do?
Well, the first thing was, in the first hour, it was to get the crew back on a free return trajectory and basically get them coming home. We also recognized that we're going to have to use the lunar module as a lifeboat. Now, fortunately, as a result of training, we had developed a lot of these procedures during the Apollo 9 mission. So we had a benchmark to start, but the key thing was getting the people in place to start working the problem.
So who on the ground did you have working the problem? I mean, is there a crew in the module at that point who's...
No, we didn't have time to get into simulation. We were trying to get to a stable position with the crew and the spacecraft so we could get time to think. And the key thing is that we knew that the command service module was going to die because we had pulled 2 of the fuel cells offline. The 3rd fuel cell was about 20 minutes from going south on us. So we got the crew over to the lunar module, and then it was to get that guy powered up sufficiently so we could transfer the navigation data from the command module, which is going to die, and get it over in the lunar module. So basically we had that entire process going through, and it was really interesting to watch that team work. It took about 20 minutes before everybody started working in the same direction. But once we got moving, we moved.
So Fred, what was going on with you three guys?
Well, when this happened, I was still in the lunar module putting away things we had pulled out because we just completed a TV show. You'd appreciate that. And the show had to go on, right? So I was putting away the equipment we had pulled out. When I got up to the right seat and looked at the panel, I frankly didn't pick up the fuel cells, but I did notice that tank 2, oxygen tank 2, quantity, pressure was down, and that meant an abort. There's no question that when you lose a single critical element in a system, I didn't have to reference mission rules that I knew the landing was off. So I was just at that time sick of my stomach with disappointment that I trained through 2 missions, and here was the big chance, and it was gone in an instant. The next thing that hit was confusion because we had 7 caution and warning lights on, a master alarm, and a computer blue restart light. And it did not make sense because these spacecraft are very simple. Each system stood alone on its own. They were simplex in that sense. There was no big computer that was integrating everything. So there was no way one failure could have caused all those lights in different systems. In the RCS, we had AC overload, we had DC undervolt, and the cryogenic lights on, and it just didn't make sense. Kind of in simulation, we had a rule, sort of a standing rule, that when they gave us failures, they normally would not give us one failure, more than one failure at one time in one system. It's kind of like, I guess, God was not going to be so unkind as to give us more than one failure at one time. So but it turned out that many of the lights were false lights. The G-shock of the explosion had closed some of the valves, had overcome the spring tension, and some of the gas and the RCS valves, and valves that normally were open, had been closed. Now on our panel, we had a little talkback that was gray and barber pole to a switch you'd move to tell you it was open or closed. But we did not have, that was not connected to the valve. That was connected to the switch. So it wasn't until Mission Control, who had telemetry to the valves, noticed that and had us recycle some valves. Most of those caution warning lights went away, except the ones obviously involved with the electrical system.
There was one little incident that's kind of interesting because it shows some of the thought process that's going through. Of course, we lost 3 fuel cells, 2 oxygen tanks, computer went off the line, and in Mission Control, when they first saw the instrumentation on their consoles that were reflected through coming down from telemetry from our instrument panel, the first thing was, hey, no, this has got to be a communications problem. We can't lose 3 fuel cells, 2 oxygen tanks, and do all this at one time. I mean, don't we believe in redundancy? Don't we have reliability at those 16 nines or something like that? And so it was a little time, wasn't it? Until finally it dawned on everybody. And meanwhile, Fred and I were sneaking our way into the lunar module to find out just what we had to work with.
And what did you have to work with? What did you have to do in terms of maintain electrical power?
Well, the first thing, I think that Gene was correct. We had to transfer the guidance system from the dyne command module to the lunar module. Now, the two are not made it exactly in the same X, Y, Z planes. So there was a correction that we had to do from the angles that the command that Schweikert sent to me to what I had to put the correction in before I could put it into the lunar module computer system to make sure that the guidance system and the lunar module corresponded to the same position of the spacecraft that we had that we did have. And so I got the angles, and then I asked them to say, would you check my arithmetic?
You were doing this manually with a
Yeah, in those
bad
days
pen.
we did things manually. I had a pencil and I had my little checklist, and it said I put the angle in, and there was the correction that I had to do, and then I wrote it down. And so I called them up. I wasn't afraid to ask anybody if 2 and 2 are really 4 in this particular instance.
Yeah, you have to really appreciate how dumb the computers we had in those days. Because really the ones we had in mission control, 90% of the computing resources was associated with trajectory. Only a very small percentage was associated with driving displays. So basically this was a pencil paper computation we had to get, and it had to be perfect.
So what happened next, Jim?
Well, we got through, and of course the mission control called up and said, "You're in the lunar module." We said yes, and we're turning on the systems, and we transferred the guidance. And they said, "Then this is the best idea to get us back on the free return course." That free return course would get us back around the moon, back down to the Earth, and hopefully it would be a safe passage through the atmosphere. And that was something which we really wanted, because at the time that we were, or the course that we were on when the explosion occurred was not a free return course. If we didn't have the main propulsion system at this time. We lost that along with electrical power and the oxygen. Consequently, if we went around the moon and came back to the Earth, the closest point of approach to the Earth would have been about 40,000 miles out. And consequently, we were in this hybrid long elliptical orbit, and we could be there for decades, just going out 240,000 miles to the apogee, coming back around Earth, but not close enough. So we had to get back on that free return course, and that's where, of course, Mission Control had us and how they wanted us to make the maneuver.
Yeah, basically the key thing was the decision process was get them a trajectory, start working the power management, power problem that we had, figure out what are we going to use, because we left the inertial system up, and we knew that being mechanical system there would be some drift. So we had to have some way to check that. Get ready in the vicinity of the moon, come up with the get home fast maneuver, then start working up the checklist that you needed for the reentry phase. While we were doing that, basically we found out that we had some aberration in the trajectory. So now with no computer, no display system, we had to come up with a way to basically execute a maneuver using the descent engine on board the spacecraft. The crew executed that thing there. We continued to work the problem, got the crew back into the Earth environment, believe it or not. We had to perform another maneuver, emergency maneuver, in the final 7 hours in there, which blew our electrical power profile. So now we're back trying to find some way to make up more power. And basically we lost battery C during entry. So we lost one of our 3 batteries during entry.
So, Fred, yeah, Jim, sorry, yeah, go, Jim.
There was one thing that was unusual. After we decided that Mission Control was going to give us the proper attitude to maneuver to get back onto the free return course, and would use our landing engine for that maneuver, the information was set up. We put it in the computer and I started to manually make the maneuver to get to the new position. And I learned something that I took with me out of the space program into business. Always expect the unexpected, because we were flying in the lunar module, but we had attached to the lunar module a 60,000-pound dead mass, the command service module. The command module is the only thing that had a heat shield to get back into the Earth's atmosphere. The center of gravity was not in the center of the lunar module, essentially, to make the maneuvers. It was way out in left field someplace. And therefore, in the short period of time that I had to figure out how to maneuver all over again. I had to figure out that when I put an input in, just what the output was going to be. And it took some time to do that, but fortunately, I finally got to the proper attitude so we could use the lunar module engine to get back on what we thought was the free return course.
So what were the breathing challenges, Fred? Breathing, oxygen.
We lost everything in the lunar module. Fred had talked about that.
No, I think you're referring to the CO2 buildup.
Yep.
Yeah. The situation there was the LEM had not enough cartridges. In fact, the spare cartridges were down on a mesa on a descent stage, which were to be retrieved during the first EVA. And even that would not have been adequate. So they had to figure out a way, people on the ground figured out a way to use gray tape, stiff backs of checklists and whatever, to build a plenum around a square cartridge versus the cylindrical LEM one and attach it to the intake hose on the lunar module's side and force the air to be sucked through that, which served the purpose. And of course there were abundance of those cartridges available from the command module. I think we replaced it once. All we did was stuck another cartridge on and gray taped around it, and we could have just kept stacking those cartridges if we had to solve that problem.
How long did it take to get back to Earth?
I'm sorry? What was the mission time?
Right. How long did it take from the explosion before you got back to Earth's atmosphere?
Well, you'd have to subtract 53 from 146. So I don't have my calculator with me, but yeah, this happened at 53 hours, et cetera, and the mission time was a little over 146 hours.
So when you stepped onto the aircraft carrier, gentlemen, what was the mood?
After we stepped,
Yeah.
after we got home,
Yeah.
well, there's one of high elation, of course. We the helicopter put us on the deck, and we waved at everybody, and we thought that we cheated death again.
No, one thing I'll add that, of course, at the time we weren't too happy with North American with the performance of the command module, but you have to realize that we shut the thing off for 4 days, and it got very cold. In fact, the water tanks were still found frozen after it was recovered back on the carrier. And fortunately, the Apollo 1 fire had done a fix with a lot of, not just a hatch, but a lot of wiring and better hermetically sealing of connectors, which again helped us because the vehicles got very damp and wet. We had water, if you look behind the wall in the LEM, globs of water on every turn of a wiring or a connector path for the plumbing. And when we got ready to power up the command module, Jack and I did that, and it was covered with water. We had to get a towel out to wipe off the instrument panel. And we worried about that time about shorts. And that was those fixes done on Apollo 1 that saved us. In fact, Jack, we said first steps was to put all the circuit breakers back in. And we said we'll count down and we'll push in 6 circuit breakers only on each side. And we'll wait and see if we can smell insulation burning. And then we can pull them back out quickly and discern which one was the bad one. And that's the way we went through all the circuit breakers, getting them in. And we never had anything happen. And you think about it, frozen for 4 days, we violated specifications, certainly on the electronics equipment in that vehicle. And it worked, it came to life, and it worked perfectly. I mean, to me, it was I kidded the subsystem managers, some of them, that they over-designed the vehicle, but it was a good machine. I mean, it went through that abuse, if you will, and came back to life and got us through entry.
And that's the story of Apollo 13.
There's one last incident concerning 13. As we're coming down, and it appears that the things were working, and the chutes came out, and we finally slowed down, and it appears that everything was okay. Swigert says, listen, let's not tell them that we're okay. This might make a good movie.
And by the way, how many of you are aware that Jim was actually in the movie? Whole new career there, Jim. You're looking for it. So that's Apollo 13. Gene, you look like you're...
Yeah, one last comment on the splashdown. Once the crew got aboard the carrier, we had a sweetheart deal with the Cigar Institute of America. We went through 14 boxes of cigars there.
So 13 made it. Joe Engle, was on the backup crew for 14. And later on, he got bumped off 17. You really seemed to get a bump that wasn't fair, because anyway, especially off of 17. But tell us about 14. How successful was 14, and what was its mission, Joe?
14 was Al Shepard's mission, of course, and Ed Mitchell and Stu Rusin. And I happened to be with Gene Cernan and Ron Evans and the backup crew for Apollo 14. So we were continually nipping at their heels to try and see if we couldn't get them to sprain an ankle or turn a knee or something. We did. We in fact, Al set up a kind of a crew retreat at a friend's cabin in Colorado, and Al did things right always. We got there, and there were 6 Kawasaki mountain bikes there for us to ride, and Ron and I looked at each other. Gene and I actually looked at each other and said, "Here's our chance," because the guys are all competitive, and we decided we would have this contest. They were in a parking lot with a dirt berm that kind of went up, and they'd graded off the lot level. So we tried these Kawasaki's out, running up there, jumping, and seeing how far we could jump with the motorcycles, and thought, this is it. This is a good deal. We'll go to Al into a competition, and we'll just keep going until we can get him to fall or something. And Ed Mitchell, bless his old intelligent heart, the guy had, I don't know, PhD from MIT or something like that. And Ed said, well, let's see how we would do this, Joe. And so he had Gene and I out with the Kawasaki's running, demonstrating how you'd, hit this berm and jump and leap. And so he had completely turned the tables on us. We were the ones doing the risk, and he was sitting back there laughing. And of course, it didn't work. But then, so we rotated around, as Buzz explained earlier. We would rotate, skip 2 missions, and then rotate back into the prime crew. So we were the prime crew for Apollo 17, and it turned out that the program lost, or was the last 3 flights, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, were canceled, which meant that 17 was the last mission. And Jack Schmidt was the lunar module pilot, back up on 15, and was going to be the prime on 18, but with 18 canceled, the scientific community, the geology community were pushed very hard to have Jack move forward and put on the last flight to the moon as the lunar module pilot. And, it wasn't my idea, but it sure made sense. That you have a guy with a doctorate degree in field geology going to the moon if you've got a chance to get him there. So it was, as I said, it was a disappointment, very big disappointment. But I understood the rationale behind it completely, and was very proud of it. Incidentally, I don't know whether the thing, I didn't get to go land on the moon, which I very much would like to have done, but that experience let me get close and get all the training for a lunar mission, which was totally incredible, and I think everybody on the panel would agree. The education was there. If you just wanted to soak a little bit of it, you could, but there was so much to learn and in so many fields, so many disciplines, that I wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. Plus, I got to know a lot better and got to work with and train with, I don't want to get gooey now, but this incredible bunch of true American heroes that you got on the stage here tonight, and I'll never be sorry for that. And Al, I mean, you, Al, especially you, Al. I was looking over this way, but I wanted to include you on that too.
That's all right.
Okay.
That's all right, Joe. I'm right behind you all the way.
So Al, 15. What were the new things that happened in 15? We talked early on from, the Mercury to Gemini and so forth. What had happened before allow you to do on 15?
Okay, 15 was a new model of spacecraft. We were upgraded. We carried a lot of extra equipment that had never been carried before, as you know. We carried the first lunar rover, the little electric car that they drove on the surface. That gave them quite an extended capability on the lunar surface. And we carried a scientific instrument package into lunar orbit. In that, we had, kind of interesting, we had two large cameras. The large camera, which is a high-resolution camera, was one that had been developed back in the 1950s by a company in Boston called Icon. And it was a ball opticon camera, but it was a camera that was designed to be flown in U-2 aircraft at 60, 70,000 feet. And the Air Force had declared it obsolete before our flight, so we were able to get it on our flight. And I've often wondered when the Air Force declared that obsolete, I've always been curious about what they replaced it with, because it had to be something pretty spectacular. Because I could take a picture from 60 miles of objects on the lunar surface down to about 4 feet. I actually have pictures of the lunar module, or the lunar rover, sitting next to the lunar module at the landing site for Apollo 15. I took about pictures with that high-resolution camera of about 25% of the moon surface. And along with that, we had a mapping camera that did the same thing, except it took individual frames along the trajectory. And it had a laser altimeter associated with it that recorded the altitude, if you will, of the film above the ground. And then I had a series of, I think 6 or 7, I forget now the exact number, but of remote sensors that were all on arms that I could extend, like the Canada-Arm kind of thing. And we had like microwave, we had X-ray, we had alpha particle, we had mass spectrometer, we had all these things. In fact, I'll tell you about the mass spectrometer. Mass spectrometer is an interesting... Answer your phone, Dave.
Ooh, sorry about that.
Is that the next question coming up? We had the mass spectrometer we took because we were just playing around with seeing if there was anything in the lunar atmosphere. We really spent a lot of time on the science on our flight. And so I'd stick the mass spectrometer out for a while and, say, what's going on, and they actually picked up some stuff in lunar orbit, I think. If we go back and check the records, Gene, I think we'll find it, where they found something in lunar orbit, which is not supposed to be there, but it turned out to be urine. And it was a result of a urine dump that we had done a couple of revs before that, and stuff was still floating around out there in lunar orbit. So we actually recorded a little of us from lunar orbit. But those are the things we carried. Now, the lunar rover was a very, very interesting device. It was a little electric car that folded up almost into a suitcase size. I think it weighed about 480 pounds, something like that. It was built by Boeing, but Boeing at the time, in fact, one of the big reasons that we started switching flights around was even if the lunar module was late, and that caused the 8-9 shift. We thought the lunar rover was going to be late too. So we got a hold of the General Motors people and asked them if they could help. And we ended up taking it down to Santa Barbara to the GM test range down there. And I'm trying to think, the fellow that ran that test range ended up as an administrator of NASA, I believe. Anyway, within about a month they fixed it and we were all set to go. So it worked out really well.
Did you go out to retrieve film? Did you do an EVA?
Yeah, I did a spacewalk on the way back home. Kind of an interesting process there. It leads me to talk about a kind of a thing with me. God bless engineers. They make everything that we use. I don't know how many are out here, but we would not have done any of the flights if it hadn't been for the engineers. But somebody has to sit on the engineers to keep them real. Okay? Because I think engineers can go out a little ways if they are given the opportunity. Well, I had a system by which I was going to recover all this film, and the system had already been prescribed before I got on a flight, and the system basically was an endless clothesline. I was to take out a pulley with a clothesline on it, take it out and put it in a mount on the outside of the space of the back of the service module, and one in the hatch. And Jim would put one in the hatch, and then I'd walk out or float out there, and I would take the canister, which is about 90 pounds. It's a pretty good sized canister, and clip it onto this clothesline, and then Jim would pull this thing back into the hatch and stow it inside the command module so we could get it back through the atmosphere. Well, I took a look at that and I said, I don't like that. There's something wrong with it. It's not going to work. I don't think it's going to work right. Well, we have tested it completely in the water tank. We know it's going to work. Oh, well, let me ask you, what was the weight of the cassette that you put in it? Well, we made it out of Teflon, and we cut a lot of holes in it to make it neutrally buoyant. And I said, and you're using that as what's going to happen in space when you got 90 pounds instead of this lightweight thing. Well, we think it'll work. And I said, I don't think it will. So I insisted on going in a zero-G airplane. And as a matter of fact, that particular flight, I think, was that one. We set the world's record for the most number of zero-G flights. Harry Andonian from Dayton came down and flew the airplane, and we did 125 parabolas that day. And there's a picture around somewhere that I think will attest to the fact. But anyway, the reason we took so long was I wanted to make sure this thing was either going to work or not. So we got into it, and it was very interesting to me because it's about a 30-foot stretch from the hatch back to where the film cassettes were. And so that clothesline was 30 feet. And I said, I don't believe, since there's no friction in space, you've got this 90-pound mass. We don't know what that mass is going to do. If there's any jerking on the rope at all, we got a problem. And sure enough, the thing got halfway back, and a little jerk on the rope, and the thing started swinging back and forth, and it actually knocked the RCS quad right off the side of the service module. So he said, oh, well, I think we proved the point. We can't do that. So I said, okay, we got to do something simple. Let's do it from an engineering standpoint, but it's got to be simple. Give me a wrist tether with a hook, and I'll carry the damn thing back. All I got to do is hold on to it, float back, give it to Jim, go back out and get the other one. I had 2 cassettes. So I said, okay, we'll give that a whirl. So I had this wrist tether, and it had a little hook on it. And the engineers came back and they said, the safety people come back and they said, well, we like the idea of doing that, but we don't think it's very safe because if you hit that hook, it could come undone and you'd lose the cassette. And I said, okay, what do you want to do? They said, we want to put a hole in the hinge and put a pin in it. Okay, that's fine. I'll go along with that. I mean, that's an extra precaution. So about 2 weeks went by and I came back again and they said, we are still not happy with it. I said, what's the problem? Well, we think that the pin is great, but we want to drill a hole in the end of the pin and put a cotter key in that so the pin won't come out. Jesus, where are we going to end this thing anyway? I mean, how far do we have to go? But the point was that I had this idea that the right engineering solution is the one that makes the most sense and is logical and is simple. And that's how you get things to work.
How did you make it?
Yeah, it worked. Anyway, the EVA was fine. I went out a couple of times. One of the problems I ran into is that I had trained too well for it, so in 37 minutes I was done. And I'm thinking, holy mackerel, now what do I do? I'd love to, well, I did go back out a third time, put my feet in some foot restraints and look out, and it was unbelievable. I could see both the Earth and the Moon at the same time. They were in my field of view.
Wow.
You got to think about that a little bit. But that's a pretty unique place to be.
Wow. Yeah. To all of you, what did it do to you, all of you, to look back at Earth, Walt, and see it?
Well, frankly, in these days, when I look back at the whole program, our time has changed, society has changed, NASA has changed. I just feel fortunate to have lived when I did and have had the opportunity to do what I did with Apollo.
Dave, I think it's one of. I watched Earthrise 75 times, and that's the most magnificent thing you can see. It's the only thing in our sky that has color like we see here on Earth. But I will tell you, the thing that impressed me more than looking at the Earth was looking at the universe out there. That to me was the most important part of the flight for me. There was a part of the trajectory around behind the moon, or a quarter section, where I was shadowed from both the Earth and the Sun, from the albedo of the Earth and from the sunlight. So I was in total darkness, and the thing, and I'm sure we've all seen that. But if you look at the sky out there, if you're in that section of the trajectory and you look at the sky out there, you can't make out a single star because it's just a wash of light out there because there's so many stars out there, and it makes you think. You know, we are a very, very small part in a very, very big universe here. We're part of the Milky Way galaxy, of course, but we're about 2/3 of the way out on an arm. We are a little planet with a planetary system, but if you were to count the number of suns or stars, or whatever you want to call them, stars, let's say, in the Milky Way galaxy, you're talking about 400 billion stars. And if you start looking at the number of galaxies out there, you're looking at what we know of today, what they can see and what they can measure out there, even with a Hubble, we're talking a couple of 100 billion. So you're looking at the number of stars. It goes back to, I think we all remember talking to Carl Sagan about that. Carl had this idea that there are so many suns out there that have planetary systems, and of those there are so many planets that could sustain life. And no matter what number you assign to that, you come up with a positive number for a planet out there somewhere that's going to have intelligent life. You can't get away from that fact.
I do still have one thought that I would like to leave with them, because as we look at that, and the reason I said that how fortunate I feel to have lived with the program when I did, in history's shake, 500 years from now, I personally believe there's only one thing they're going to be remembering about the 20th century, and that's that man landed on the moon.
I hate to take exception to that, because 500 years from now, there may have been an eagle that landed on the moon, 1969, but I can assure you there will be an eagle that lands on Mars. And that, in my estimation, will not be a short visit or occupying it, but when we really think about it, it will be a permanent settlement. Now, that doesn't mean that in 1,000 years or so, we may decide, gee, that's just too rough living out there for all these people. We've learned enough about Mars. Maybe we really ought to start scuba diving on Europa or Enceladus. So forget about Mars. That's possible, but I really think that humanity will move and permanently, for the time being, settle on Mars, and people will go there and they will spend the rest of their life. I know this is not an easy thing to come to grips with, but I think that is our destiny. And when you look at the cost of sending people there and the cost of bringing them back and losing 2 years, and you keep doing that, and you look at the cost that adds up of sending people to Mars and bringing them back, and when you do that, if you keep it occupied, there still is a steady state number, 30, 60, that's a maximum. And the loss of the legacy of a leader of the world to have made that commitment to prepare the surface of Mars by preparing and practicing at the moon exactly what we will be doing at Mars, and then going there and living and staying, landing and staying. That is a legacy that I doubt that any world leader, when they fully understand it and realize that that's capable for us to do, even if no one by this time in 2025 has even gone back and landed on the moon, it's my prediction that a world leader will make that commitment to land and stay.
Jim?
Let me give everybody a thought that is a little bit different than anything that you've heard today or really thought about the missions that we did. On Apollo 8, of course, we saw the Earth as it really is now, just one small body in a rather large void of the solar system and the universe. Think about this for a second. We all think about, I hope to go to heaven when I die. I hope to go to heaven when I die. Ladies and gentlemen, you go to heaven when you're born. You arrive on a planet with the amount of the positive mass that provides the gravity that contains water and an atmosphere, the essentials for life. You arrive on a planet that is orbiting a star just to the right distance, not too far out to be too cold, in too far in to be too hot, just to the right distance to be able to absorb that star's energy that caused life to evolve here in the beginning. So just think about that. God has really given us, or given mankind, I should say, a stage that we saw out there for us to perform. How that play turns out is up to us.
Yeah. Can't disagree with what you say, Jim. This is a little bit of heaven down here, isn't it? It's too bad we can't all get together and make the best of it. I happen to believe that it's going to be great to go to Mars, but I think we're going to have to go a lot further than that. I think we're going to have to go out to the point where we find another habitable planet like we're in here. And that's kind of based on some sort of basic stuff. For instance, I could ask the question, what is the prime imperative of everything that's alive here on Earth? And I think you'd have to respond to that by saying it's survival of the species. That is the prime imperative of everything that's alive here on Earth, including people. And if we really have a prime imperative of survival of the species, then we've got to develop the capability of taking care of ourselves when we can't live here on the Earth anymore. And that might be 5 billion years out, but you know, it's like the old Chinese axiom or saying that a trip of 1,000 years starts with one step. And I think we made the step at the moon. The next step is going to be Mars, or maybe the next 2 or 3 steps will be Mars. But we're going to have to go out way beyond that to find a place where we can live when humanity can't live here anymore. The other heaven.
Gene?
If you will.
Last thoughts?
No, I better not give an opinion here. You know, listening to this thing, I classified people as poets and plumbers. Well, I'm one of the plumbers.
Do you have a copy of my book?
Ladies and gentlemen, the men of Apollo. Thanks, Al. Yeah, sure. Oh, God. Thank you, Buzz. Thanks. We got through it. Thanks, Fred. That's great. Thanks, sir. Yeah, see you in the morning. You too, man. Thank you, Walt. Thank you, Gene. That was fabulous. Thank you, sir.